You're about to start class when a student raises their hand and they say, "This topic feels heavy today. I'd rather talk about something else." So, as a faculty, what do you do? Welcome to Off Syllabus with Manny, where we talk about the hardest parts of teaching, the ones that never make it to the syllabus. Joining me today is Wantland from the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Access, Civil Rights, and Community. Today, we are exploring inclusive and effective facilitator skills. So, with that in mind, let's jump in.
Great.
Ross, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So, can you share a little bit about your background and what motivated you to grow and explore this field of civil discourse?
Yeah. I got my undergraduate here at University of Illinois in psychology with a minor in gender and women's studies. And in that work, I was volunteering at the local rape crisis center and got a chance to do some workshops with middle schoolers and high schoolers. And I was taking a class that one of the graduate students in the class said, "You're going to really enjoy this book," and gave me a book called Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice. It was a source book, and it was about pedagogy around social justice learning. And I was reading it and thinking, oh, there's a word for some of the things that work in the classroom, some of the things that make people more engaged or less engaged, able to talk about difficult topics or totally checked out during difficult topics, and lots of different ways to start thinking about how people learn. And so I got curious about it, and then I got to work. I got hired at the Office of Women's Programs, which is now the Women's Resources Center, as the coordinator for sexual assault prevention education. And as a man doing prevention education around sexual assault, like it made me think a lot about how do we engage men and masculine identified folks in prevention education where they are going to maybe be initially pretty defensive and feel like they are being attacked or accused, and so how do you invite people into those spaces? I've also gotten a chance to work with our diversity and social justice education unit here on campus, which does intergroup dialogue work. And now my job in the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Access, Civil Rights, and Community is around education and training around equity mindedness. How do we create more inclusive climates and organizations? Really, what is all of our role in making change and improving our campus? And that it means a lot of us figuring out ways to strategically come together for democratic principles of mutual understanding, engagement, solving problems together. And so civil discourse is just it's the foundation of it all. Like we have to be able to have some sensitivity to see the other person, understand where they're coming from, and begin to design solutions that will meet all of our needs together. And I think that plays out in the classroom, like in the picture this example that you said at the beginning. So I'm really excited to talk more and to help hopefully think about how do we do this together.
Yeah, thank you. Something that you mentioned, and I just want your take very briefly. I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, but when you talk about social justice, what does like very practically, what does social justice looks to you?
Yeah. So social justice has taken on a sort of life of its own, where it looks like a really big, maybe to some people scary thing.
Mhm.
Social justice is really how do we create environments, spaces that are designed to meet everyone's needs, that are mutually inspired, that uh, are that we're able to get there through a process of nonviolent democratic engagement so that people hear one another and are able to actively participate. It also means that we have to attend to things like structural, hierarchical or power differentials in spaces so that we can make sure people can show up and participate fully, or other experiential gaps or opportunity gaps that might be present that have meant that some people have been historically left out of these conversations. And we have to be really thoughtful that we're designing a solution together that is actually going to meet people's needs than rather than what I, as maybe someone not in those experiences, presume to be their needs.
Yeah, so something like I find sometimes hard to explain, and I'm gonna throw that question to you.
Yeah,
Is
please.
we always try to create these environments where people feel welcome to share, and we as like we talk about guides and norms and what you can do in the classroom and how you can communicate with students to build that trust so people feel that they can engage in a way that is safe. Um, so in your experience, let's say that you create that environment, or you're working on creating that environment for students or for your colleagues. It is something that can happen also in
Yeah.
in your work environment. You create the environment. How do you know that the discussions are happening in a way that is safe? Like, how do you know that the inclusive dialogue is being happening or is happening well?
Yeah, that's a great question. And like many things that are about someone's internal process, it's only something we can know so much. We may still be surprised by things that we thought were happening or that we didn't think were happening that then we learn later were happening in these spaces we're in. So I think that it's really like beginning, middle, through to the end, how do we create these environments or spaces that are thoughtful to setting up clear expectations and guides at the front that are maintaining the commitments we've made in those expectations and guides throughout and are committed to the purpose through which we are coming into this space, whatever it's a kind of class that we are learning and we're building skills in a particular area, or it is um, a space where we are coming to understand the experiences of one another in a deeper way. And then, like, I think also that means we pay attention to the end. That's like, what do we do with it when we know what we know, and how do we equip and prepare people to be able to utilize that understanding, learning, information that they've gained in that space? And so, throughout. That means that we as the instructors, as the facilitators, pay close attention to what we think might be going on for people. And we have some ways of being able to check that out and figure out what might be going on for people. There could be all kinds of ways we might build that in. I can talk about that later. But that also means that we have to constantly be reflecting on what we know and what we don't know, and figuring out ways that we can learn more. And some of that means even internally for us ourselves, like how do I know more about why I reacted strongly when this student said, I don't want to talk about this now, this feels too deep. That if I have a reaction to that and I start getting snarky, which is my cross to bear, that I sometimes will get really sarcastic and snarky when I'm upset at something happening in the space, then we've got to be able to check ourselves and say, okay, let's reel that back in. How do I invite people into this space rather than maybe unintentionally shutting down or shutting them out in some way? So that self-awareness, those tools to be aware of others, to figure out what might be going on for them, the tools to be able to create strategic kind of timeouts or breaks or self-care moments so people can bring themselves back in. One thing, Manny, about social justice education, as they talk about social justice education, is that social justice education is both a cognitive, and I think this is true of much learning that is around a social issue. It's both cognitive and psychological emotional. And so while we might be learning things, factual things, we also then have to account for what does it mean as I learn those things, or how am I reacting to those things that I learn? And there may be some very, just because we've learned some facts doesn't mean we change our opinion or change our behaviors or change our minds. So some of that work is about this coming to understand it in both a head way and a heart way, to understand what does this mean to me and how I maneuver myself in the world around me.
Yeah, and I really like that connection because we are talking about how inclusive dialogue looks like in the classroom. And it might look different because some people might be more vocal and they might be expressing things, but we don't want everybody to just say things. There is a process of reflection and internalization of things. So like having space for all these different things is great. Something that you mentioned that I really like is about it's not you create the environment, but it's not just that what creates a good discussion. There are different checkpoints. I like how you broke it down into three different components, like at the beginning and the middle and the closure at the end.
Mm.
Because as instructors, we all know that we can create the best course on paper, but when the students come in, they're gonna find all the flaws and
Yeah.
you had to adapt.
Yep. Yep. And I think that there are different needs for different learners that some of which you can preemptively install into your design. So you think about the obvious one is that you've got quieter or you've got more vocal people. And so having tools in your back pocket for in the moment or having activities that sort of um, increase the likelihood that quiet people are going to participate and decrease the likelihood that our loud people are going to take to over more of the space. And that I think people go to lots of small group work, parent share, individual writing assignments where people can individually sort of like jot down ideas before then they're sharing out then more hopefully more thought out, informed kind of concepts. Um, those things are things that we have to create. And then there's going to be things that we didn't predict that was going to be. I think that many instructors, myself included, are have had to figure out tools to engage across neurodiversity, for instance, as we are becoming more aware and attentive to different individuals' experiences of the information, the classroom, the data. What does that mean? How do we then do that in ways? And maybe that means also that we can't expect that a deep dialogue, quote unquote, involves only a certain kind of engagement that is insightful, emotional, in certain kinds of ways. But it might look different for each person. And if that is a reflective experience for them, then that might be where they need to be.
Yeah, so you open a little bit of a can of worms when you start talking about strategies and examples, because
Yeah.
then I do want examples. So
Yeah.
could you give me an example of something you would do if people are not talking? And then could you also give me an example of something you would do if things are getting too heated? Like what tools would you pull out that might, and I want to put the disclaimer that a tool is just a tool and it works different with different
Yeah.
groups of students and different faculty. So we're not saying this is what you do in every situation, but just give an example of like something like you could do.
Yeah, and they'll be different for each person. I um there's I sometimes when I'm talking with other peers, I'll have them say, "What is your facilitation superpower?" Because everybody's got some things they're really good at, and they facilitate. And how do we play into those strengths rather than thinking that I'm going to be the exact same as Manny as a facilitator? Like each of us are going to have our different strengths and strategies. I think if nobody's talking, I probably would have them do a quick write. I would have them pull out their phones or pull out a piece of paper and say and give them a prompt. I think that's another skill we build over time is asking good questions that get to reflective, open-ended critical thinking around whatever topic. I've asked a lot of bad questions or leading questions over the time because I didn't know exactly how to ask a question that would prompt them. But if I can ask it open enough, then just say, hey, write down. Well, sometimes I'll just say, take a minute and write down everything you're thinking about what we just talked about. And so they can write down whatever. They can doodle, they can do whatever that might look like. And then I'll have them turn to their neighbor and I'll say, turn to the person next to you. You don't have to share what you wrote down, but what was it like to write that down? What are some things that are going on in your head right now? And so oftentimes that's dredged up some elements that people want to talk about. I'll do that often when I'm having a sensitive conversation and the room gets quiet suddenly, and I will, this is sort of an attempt at emotional intelligence and attunement. I'll sometimes say, what's going on there? Do you notice this? And without a missing a beat, they'll all be like, we're just tired. We just had a late night. That's all. It's like clearly that's not what it was, but I'll let you have this, and then we'll do this thing's individual right, and we'll actually maybe talk about what's going on. Like, was there a dynamic in the room? Was it that this topic got really difficult to talk about? Was it got difficult to talk about with one another? What's that look like? Now, the other side, what happens if it starts to get heated? I think that feels scary because you feel actually either of those can feel scary because you feel a little out of control. And I think that we're constantly as instructors making decisions about, do I intervene? When do I intervene? Do I move us to some other topic? Do we stay on this topic? And figuring out the uh, that's something we'll learn and figure out over time for ourselves. And we probably will later reflect back and say, oh, I wish I'd done this, or I wish I'd changed that. Um, but I would remind us of our ground rules. So having guidelines and ground rules are really important. If people seem to be edging up to being disrespectful to one another or interrupting one another in an unhelpful way, where they're not letting people get their ideas out, I think that actually the same practice can be useful is to say, I want to pause this right here, and I'd like us to take a minute to write on what you were thinking about right now. Because there are other ways we can take timeouts or stop or pause. Sometimes something that is helpful is to redirect the conversation to why it is difficult for us to have this conversation, because then we get to have conversations about the phenomena of what we're seeing happen. Oftentimes, I find that what's going on in the classroom is a mirror to what might be happening out in their student organizations, where they live, the world around us, as we're trying to engage in these difficult conversations. And so reminding them of that, reminding them to take a beat, reminding them of the goals to try on new ideas, to critically think, are some of the things that I often use in that moment. And then I might also, if somebody crossed the line, but I didn't feel like I needed to talk with them about it in the space, I might pull them aside later. Or if it feels like they've been they're upset about something that's happened, pull them aside later afterwards and say, hey, can I talk to you afterwards? And then just tell them what I observed. Like I noticed this. I noticed you got really quiet when that was happening. I noticed your voice got louder as we were talking about this. If there's some feedback I have to give them about how they participate in the classroom, then I might try to give that to them then. It's always better to do it in a timely manner. In a week, they're not going to remember what they said or did. They may not have like a real clear so pinpointing it in that moment can be really helpful. And then that also gives me an opportunity to offer them resources or uh, um, other assignments, other kind of activities that they might be able to participate in more fully.
Yeah, I like this. So like we have the idea of like co-creating guides for discussion is one way, and then we had the two other tools about the 1 minute paper. So the
Mm-hmm.
example, just
Mm-hmm.
take and
Mm-hmm.
read and do a think, pair, share. It's a combination
Yeah.
of the two.
Yeah.
Great ways I can do either or, right? Things people are not
Yeah.
talking, you start small to big, or people are going to places that you don't want to. So then give
Yeah.
them a time to like reflect, think about, talk to somebody prefers, like get those
Yeah.
words out
Yep.
before you engage with the whole classroom. So thank you for that. Because
Yeah.
my next question was something you can do in any discipline, and I think that is a great example of something you can do in
Yeah.
any discipline regardless.
Well, another thing that I think about is using cognitive mapping or cognitive organizers. So uh, sometimes we think dialogues have to be verbal, kind of like spitfire, and it can actually be engaging people in a slightly different task to organize the information that we're considering, to help them synthesize and think about. So I've seen a lot of different ways that people might do this, but it simply comes down to asking people to organize the concepts on a big sheet of paper, on a chalkboard, in relationship to one another. And they can use pictures, they can use lines, they can create other sort of models, but that's a way to say, this is really complex information. How do I take that to a deeper understanding of how this complex information relates to each other? And And that can be really helpful for you as the instructor to also get a sense where are they at with how they're perceiving what we're talking about right now, and where might be some things that we need to work on more to maybe scaffold their knowledge and understanding in a better way.
Yeah, and just to close this episode, I want to go back to something you mentioned before about the superpowers. It took
Hmm.
me a while for me to realize what my superpower was, and I don't know if this is my real superpower, but I always say
Yeah.
it now that is that I'm not intimidating, so people just talk to me and
Uh-huh.
it
Uh-huh.
allows the conversations.
Yeah. You're
How did you
disarming.
discover yours?
A lot of trial and error, a lot of feedback, a lot of saying, I think I'm really good at this. And people look at me and they're like, you're not that funny. And
Sure.
so yeah, I think that the thing that I've found that I've heard from others is I'm good at normalizing things that feel a little bit outside of the conversation we're having together and helping people bring that back into the conversation because people may be a little bit to the side of where we're talking about, but it's still important, and it's still important for them to feel like part of the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. So big thanks, Rose, for joining us today.
Thank
I
you so
learned a
much.
lot. I always learn a lot from talking to you. You're fantastic. I think one of the biggest takeaway today is there's no one answer to how to facilitate discussions,
Right.
but something core and important is to understand how you feel in that environment, like explore your superpower, know how you can navigate this, and also have check-ins throughout that discussion
Yeah.
because things are gonna go sideways at times, and you just have to be
Mhm.
prepared, but also recognize how you feel in that environment so you
Yeah.
can navigate the situation. So
Yeah.
thank you,
Thank
thank
you.
you,
Yeah. Take care. Thank you.
yeah, and remember for everybody that teaching goes way beyond what's on the syllabus. So thank you for listening.